This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the greatness of experimental filmmaker from America, Maya Deren. She is considered the foremother of American avant-garde cinema, and I'll be talking with two women about her life and her influence. The subject is American filmmaker Maya Deren. She is known as one of the earliest avant-garde filmmakers in America, and I think she is one of the most important and influential. I have Renata Jackson and Moira Sullivan here to talk about her life and career. Moira is on the left, Renata is on the right of your screen. Like I always like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to talk about who they are, their relation to the subject, and their opening opinions. So let me start with you, Moira, if you could give a little background about who you are, what you do, and your opening opinions about Maya Deren.
Sure. First of all, it's Mora, not Moira.
Moira. Oh, I'm sorry.
Country pronunciation. The American pronunciation is Mora.
Okay.
And it's spelled M-O-I-R-A.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Maya Deren made a film with the three fates, which is actually the Moray. In Greek, it's Mira. And it's the triple goddess that plant a seed, cut the cloth from the seed that's grown. One other thing, oh yeah, I forgot. But there's one other thing that happens in that. So I teach, I'm a professor of cinema studies at San Francisco City College, or City College of San Francisco. And I've been there since 2013. I've lived many, many years and still live in Sweden, where I got my doctorate in cinema studies. And I also went to film school at San Francisco State and film school in Stockholm, Sweden. I came across Maya Deren because I had actually stopped making films at one point, because I thought it was so fake to make films. I mean Hollywood films. Like, I didn't want to make anything like that. And someone said, "Oh, what you say reminds me of the work of Maya Deren." And she worked a lot with relics, ancient relics that were left behind from people in their journeys through life, in their odysseys. And I had been in Sweden and been looking at ancient relics in Simrishamn, which is almost near Denmark. And I just thought they were so visually beautiful. And so I was told that Maya Deren worked in that way. And I actually didn't see her films for a while. I went by train to see her films in a film program in the south of Sweden. I was totally blown away. I started reading everything I could find out about her, and chose her to be my dissertation topic. Not only my dissertation topic, but my licentiate and my graduate thesis topic. So she kind of is a very interesting person. It was not hard to research her because she's so fascinating.
Well, you also do run mayaderen.org then too, is that correct?
Yes, yeah, I've had that website since 1993. And before the internet explosion, it was people would write all the time, and they'd have programs, and they'd let me know about those programs, but people don't do that anymore. But it's basically information forum, and a lot of people contact me, like relatives of Maya Deren or Alexander Hammond, or just all kinds of people who want film rights. It's really fun to be in contact with them. And also I get contacted to do special seminars, like in South Korea 2 years ago. I was invited in Italy, in France, different places. Something always happens. Like with you,
yeah.
This happened.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you got a hold of me, if you got a hold of me through the website, but.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, there you go.
So let me turn to Renata Jackson on the right. Same thing, a little bit of background about yourself and your interest in Maya Deren as a person and filmmaker.
Sure. So when I was an undergrad, I went to Pennsylvania State University for my bachelor's, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, but I took a film history class just to fill an arts elective, and I fell in love with film, and so became a film production major, and then I got my bachelor's in production and my master's also from Penn State in film history and aesthetics as well as production. And of course, you know, you see Meshes of the Afternoon. That was my introduction to Darren back then. And then fast forward a few years later, and I decided to go back to school for my doctorate because I'd fallen in love with teaching and I knew I wanted to teach full time. And so I went to NYU for my doctorate, and initially I wanted to write my dissertation on Jean Epstein, who's an incredible filmmaker and theorist as well. But that wasn't the right thing for me. And my advisor, Richard Allen, and I just started to talk, and he said, well, what do you really love? What do you want to, what makes your heart sing? And I said, I love thinking about and writing about film as an art form. And together we said, well, Maya Deren is just the perfect subject for me then. And as soon as we said her name, just the penny dropped, and I knew that she was the right person to do my dissertation on. So that's how I wrote my dissertation, and then published that in 2002, I think it was. And I've been teaching since the fall of 1998. I've been teaching. I'm a cinema studies professor also, and I've been teaching at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, School of Filmmaking. And I don't often get to talk about Darren because we focus mostly on classical narrative fiction at my school. And although I teach international film history, I don't very often get to talk about Darren as Darren's amazing work. You know, her experimental films are, you know, they're just incredible works of film art. So I'm glad you found me too. I don't know how you found me either, but I'm delighted, and I'm just so happy to see my old pal Maura because we saw each other in New York briefly, but many years ago, and then also at a conference in San Francisco, a Maya Deren conference that Bill Nichols organized back in 1996. Right? That was yeah.
Yeah, so I found you via Google too. So let's talk a little bit about who Darren was, where she came from before we take on her art, and not only film art, but her other artistic interests as well. From what I can see, she was a Ukrainian, and she was born in Ukraine, and then as a child came over to America. So she was born right around the time of the Russian Revolution. Was her family involved in that? Were they just peasants? What was her background, her family background, either one of you?
Well, she was, we both know the answer to this. Go ahead, Renata.
Oh, just you know, she came from an intellectual family. Her father was a psychiatrist who was a behavioral psychiatrist. She had, you know, she was an assimilated Jew. The family suffered under they escaped Kiev to escape pogroms. And 1917 was when she was born, and in 1922 is when they came to the United States, and they settled in Syracuse, New York. So, you know, childhood, she grew up, like I said, in an assimilated Jewish home with doctors and rabbis on both sides of the family.
And a dinner guest was Trotsky.
Ah.
Yeah. And then, you know, and when she was in upstate New York, she got involved in the Young People's Socialist League. So her father always said that he was, or the research says that her father was not a card-carrying communist. He wasn't sympathetic, but you sort of had to be if you were going to be in the Soviet Union back then.
Right.
Yeah.
So
But she was a socialist. She was in demonstrations, May Day demonstrations.
Sure.
She was very politically active when she went to Syracuse University, probably because of her first husband, who was a union organizer.
Right.
But that changed. She got off that age.
Right. Gregory Bardacke was her first husband, and then towards the end of the 30s, they divorced, and also she moved away, as Maura said, from socialist activism, and probably because you just needed, if you were against totalitarianism, you needed to be against the fascists as well.
So, did she have any siblings?
No,
No.
she was an only child.
I know that she also initially started off as a dancer. Was she classically trained? Did she go to ballet school?
No.
She wasn't a dancer. That's one of the misconceptions about
really?
her. She wasn't a professional dancer.
Oh no.
But she had, and right, Maura, she never pretended to be a professional dancer. She always said, that's why she worked with professional dancers, but she felt that she had ability, but she never studied. And even though she worked, she was employed by Catherine Dunham, who was a choreographer, an African-American choreographer. She wasn't allowed to dance with the dancers. They weren't an integrated dance troupe. And she didn't study dance with them either.
I saw a clip of her speaking, or I think it was from that biography that was done in the late 90s or early O's, where she said that she wanted to be a poet, but she was a lousy poet. What was some of her influences, or was she initially, did she really actually want to be a poet, but she couldn't do it and then decided?
She might have been. She was interested in the symbolist poets, and she had studied. She wrote a master's thesis on them, actually, which served her in her films, because the philosophy of symbolism is plunging to the depth for meaning, and she felt that her films were poetic in that respect. That you had to. It wasn't on the surface. It wasn't anything that was easily understood. It was something experienced. So I've read some of her poems, and actually in The Legend of Maya Deren, the 2-volume set, the first one, you can see some of her poems.
She did want to be a writer, right? She wanted to be a creative writer, and then when she met Hammett, that really
Alexander Hammett, his second husband.
Alexander Hammett, right? And then her. I mean, she had interest and understanding about film before. I mean, she took a film appreciation course at Syracuse.
Well, let me just ask. So she came to America in 22 when she was 5.
Right.
So was she drawn to silent films that were around? Was she a Chaplin fan, a Harold Lloyd fan, a DeMille fan? What?
She liked Jean Cocteau.
Okay. Yeah, she loved Cocteau. She, in Anagram, she does mention that she likes Hollywood films. She finds some of them entertaining, but basically her aesthetic is so diametrically opposed to Hollywood filmmaking that.
Well, the reason I asked, though, is most of her films, even though you can find a lot of virtually everything online, some of them have scores done by people years later, some that were approved by her, others done just in the last decade or so. So let's talk a little bit about the general idea of her films. Why were the more famous ones that are credited solely to her mostly silent?
She believed in the silent film modem. She believed that was part of the artistic process, that you didn't need synchronized sound with film.
Right.
So the people who are adding soundtracks on YouTube is kind of hilarious, some of them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it makes it cringeworthy.
The point is to improve the film by adding something, which often happens with soundtracks, that they're added to improve the film. To give meaning to it, but she would have disagreed with that having some kind of a literal meaning. But I do want to add one thing about Meshes of the Afternoon, that she changed the music on that because she didn't like the interpretations that she was getting from that film. She thought she was getting the interpretations were Freudian. So I don't know how she put on the music of her third husband, Teiji Ito. I don't know how she changed that Freudian interpretation by having his music in the background. But I believe that was silent. Was that not silent?
Correct. So Meshes was silent, and she actually stopped screening it because she was screening it less and less over the years because more and more people were interpreting the flower and the key and the knife in Freudian terms.
Uh-huh.
And so she stopped showing that, and then she met, and then she met Teiji in the early 50s. They didn't get married until 1960, but it was 1958 or 59 that she asked Teiji to write a score for it, and she felt, and you're right, Maura. I mean, she felt that this modernist score that was more oriental against the Occidental imagery. The film was made in Hollywood. And then here's this very modernist score that Teiji, very dissonant modernist score that he composed. She was hoping that would tamp down the Freudian interpretation. But that's the, that flaw in her argument, that you're not changing the imagery. You can't prohibit somebody's interpretation of a work when those symbols are there.
So was her use of silence or lack of any soundtrack, was that because she believed that film was an image first
Yes.
medium? Yeah, because a lot of times you look at there are some great films that are sort of literature with pictures, where
Right.
she wanted the image first.
Right. In fact,
said that exactly,
Yeah.
but her films were silent, and she considered it an art form. But I have never read anything where she said film image first. Have you, Renata?
well, what I would say is that, just as you'd mentioned that she wrote her master's thesis on the symbolist poets, she was also influenced by the imagist poets, who with their poetry felt that they were evoking images that were inherently meaningful, and that their poems, given the right word in the right cadence and rhythm, that those were inherently meaningful forms.
Mhm.
So she borrows the term imagism or the philosophy of imagism, and it makes perfect sense, with a visual medium of film, given her philosophy of true film art being from this intensely motivated point of view that creates a new whole that should be, that is in and of itself meaningful, a gestalt that is meaningful.
Well, to me, for her, the image, just the audience's engagement with that image should convey her intention to the viewer. And so, if rhythm and the creative shaping of space-time, which is what she was, what she felt that true film art was, the creative manipulation of space-time into a new whole, then I can see why she would think that, no, the film certainly doesn't need dialogue, because again, her aesthetics is what's called essentialism, not a term I'm terribly fond of, but it's a descriptive term. It tends to be a condescending term, or the connotation or the denotation is negative. Yeah.
Essentialism, this idea of each art form having its own unique capabilities, and therefore what the art form can do is what it must do in order to be true to the medium. So she didn't want film art to borrow from literature or theater.
well,
As you said about the Gestalt, that she felt that film should create something new, and that the art instrument of filmmaking was the camera and the editing. And so if you didn't create anything new, you were just replicating a reality which she didn't believe film should do. So in that respect, she didn't need sound, she needed image.
Right.
She needed image, and she needed the cutting board, of course. And she edited all her films, and she was very economical in her editing. She wrote a lot for so-called amateur filmmakers, and that word she actually has given new meaning, that amateur means loving one's craft.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
She would write articles about, like, for example, creative cutting. shoot to cut, that you'd have the plan in your head before you actually shot, which would be very economical because you knew exactly what you wanted to do. And she always storyboarded, and she hated the improvisational movement that came after her. So
Yep.
I know that just as someone who's not a film expert, but who appreciates art, the thing that I noticed right away when watching all of her films in a sequence was I think there was a tremendous amount of growth. Meshes in the Afternoon is her most famous film because it's, I guess, her first solo one. But I think the two later films that At Land and Study in Choreo, well, no, which is the one with the professional dancer, not
Ritual and
Transfigured
Transfigured
Time.
Time.
I think they are both cleaner. They are both more mature films because they do lack. One of the things that when I watch Meshes, and we'll get into this the films individually in a little bit, but there seems to be a little bit heavy-handed symbolism in there. What you were talking about, what she was seeing, like the mirror, the guy with the mirror, the sort of the figure of death with the mirror. Whereas once you get to At Land, which that and the other one I think are better films overall. There seems to be less heavy-handedness in the symbolism, and it seems to flow better, more naturally as a dream. What is your take on that? Do you think that she was evolving away from the symbolism of the Meshes?
well, she made that film with Alexander Hammond, and I don't know how much influence he had on her when she was making it, but it was very classical in its setup, and well, as he said, you know, it was her film, it was her idea. So were all of her films. They were all her conceptions, and
Correct.
I just think also they separated after a period of time, but
47.
I don't think that she evolved because, well, she started off as a photographer. She wasn't a filmmaker. She learned filmmaking from him.
Right.
But since she was a skilled photographer, it wasn't that he had to teach her much.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of talk about that, about his influence on her films. But as he would say himself, it was hers. It was her idea.
So
I don't know, Dan. You know, we'll have to agree to disagree on. I mean, I absolutely love Meshes. I think it's elegant. I love this structure. I think it's a really fine example of repetition with difference. And yes, you can read it doesn't detract from me the Freudian symbolism. It bothered Darren, but I think, you know, it's very interesting that film. To me, and a lot of film scholars see it as whether she would admit it or not, it shows a very troubled heterosexual relationship. I mean, you don't have a scene in which a woman throws a knife at her lover and think that this is a good relationship. I absolutely adore At Land as well. I love the temporal structure, right? It seems that the past coexists in the present, it moves forward and then reverses itself. Ritual and Transfigured Time is also, I think, you know, I mean, we're obviously not objective here. I love her work. Those sort of, I refer to Meshes of the Afternoon and At Land and Ritual and Transfigured Time as all of them as inverted odysseys. Darren referred to At Land as an inverted odyssey because of that forward and reverse movement of the protagonist.
But that's just in the beginning.
Yeah.
But you know, it's interesting to look at what she's written, to read her shooting scripts, her outtakes. Like for Ritual and Transfigured Time is a totally different film, and in the new Blu-ray, I do the narration for Ritual and Transfigured Time and bring that up. What she had thought about for that film was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And what she's thought about her other films, like Jonas Mekas used to say that the outtakes for study and choreography for camera is really great for beginning film students to see how that film was put together. So again, we have to think about the editing, and we have to think about what it was before it got to final cut.
So one of the things that I noticed in looking up Darren's filmography is there's the 6 or 7 films that are considered sort of canon, including the later one that became a documentary, which I guess is still considered canon. Then there's a couple of films that are she is credited on, like she's credited on The Private Life of a Cat, which is really a Hammett film. So I don't know what she really did there. And then there's a couple of other ones that sort of hit and miss that she might have edited or whatnot. So before we get to sort of the big 6 or 7 that are, her canon that are always talked about, let's talk about Hammett and what some of these films like The Private Life of a Cat. What was her role on that? I mean, it's an interesting film to see, the cats. It's a 25 minutes film, but there's anything, I mean, it's more of like a nature documentary almost.
Well, there's two versions of that. You have to see both versions,
Oh, yeah?
because there's the Maya Deren version and then there's the Alexander Hammett version. I think he cut it afterwards. I don't know if they were still together when he cut it, but it's on the new Blu-ray, and I've actually written about that in the liner notes about the Private Life of the Cat. But she's doing the voiceover, and that's not in the version that you probably are familiar with. Yeah. And then that film was also banned a little bit because of the birds, that was considered too much for American audiences. I don't know, banned or censored or whatever. But
it's wonderful, and hearing her voice, it's just her beautiful gravelly.
You've seen
voice.
that version. I just love that, and it's much more Egyptian. The influence of Egypt on cats and mythology. It's not as instructional as the Hammett one, and I really don't know the story about why he made another version, and the lettering is different on it, and the voiceover is different on it. Everything about it is different, but the shots are pretty much the same. It's just they're edited different in the one where she does the voiceover. That obviously is her.
And why they did it? Do you know why they just? I mean, first of all, how their apartment always had cats. I mean, she adored cats. So, but other than that, other than being cat lovers, I think they just did it for fun.
What was the film the unfinished film that she did before Meshes? There was one that I think she did in the late 30s.
Not in the late 30s. Witch's Cradle. Do you mean Witch's Cradle?
That might be it. Let me take a look. Was that the before Meshes, Witch's Cradle?
No, that was.
It would have been after.
No, 1943. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's.
Which one was before Meshes? I don't remember anything before.
I don't think there is anything before Meshes.
No, because that was her introduction. I mean, exactly. Behind the camera and her at the cutting board.
So why isn't Witch's Cradle considered the second film rather than At Land? I mean, is it because
it's unfinished? That's one.
And also, she made it with Marcel Duchamp at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum, and it was more. I was an expert. I don't know. It fits in a repertoire because there are objects that get displaced, like in Meshes, missing rope and then appearing rope, and it fits in more with this philosophy of the medieval period magic, and it's something she cooked up with him more, and it was sponsored by Peggy Guggenheim.
But she didn't, she had a few days of shooting, and then she wasn't able to use the gallery after that, so she was never able to finish it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting film, but it's too much Duchamp and not enough Deren in it, in my opinion.
I agree.
You can just let him make his own film.
Yeah, that's one of the things too. You mentioned that she was a fan of Jean Cocteau. I'm not. I think she's much better because for me, Cocteau was a show off. He was very he was more about himself. When I think I was also in the last few days. I'm not. I think she's so much better than say Stan Brakhage or especially Kenneth Anger. I saw a few Kenneth Anger films from the '60s. And I thought his use of music is horrible, and he seemed to not understand the power of the image the way she did, although he cites her as an influence. If you compare her, just to step back a moment, compare her to her predecessors like Cocteau and the people that came after her like Anger, to me, she seems a much more interesting filmmaker just in her content and the way she presents it. Do you agree or not with that?
Of course, I agree with that.
Yeah, yeah, I do too. I mean, although I'm a fan of Cocteau as well, not so much of Anger's work, but I mean, Darren was really clear on what she felt film art was.
Yeah.
And it was a really solid aesthetic, whether you agree with her ideas about what true film art is or should be. She stood on the shoulders of artists, poets like the Imagists and the Symbolists, and where she wanted to distinguish herself was, she hated when people referred to her films as surrealist. So that's maybe something we can also talk about. I mean, her films like Meshes and Atland and Ritual and Transfigured Time, people could certainly talk about the similarities between her work and the surrealists, but they're, in terms of, if you think about surrealism as the inextricable intersection of the fantastic, the marvelous, and the mundane, her films certainly have that as well. But the Surrealist project was all about l'amour fou, and parody and iconoclasm. And that's nowhere in evidence in any of her inverted odysseys.
Another of her unfinished films is called Ensemble for Somnambulists. What was that about? Because I only was able to find a maybe 20, 30-second clip from that. And why was that unfinished? Were these films that just I'm assuming that money wasn't an issue because they're not,
The students owned that film. She made that
yeah.
with students in Toronto, and it's a predecessor to The Very Eye of Night.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So
Yeah.
she was trying. It's pretty much a prototype of Very Eye of Night, and there's a lot people have written about that, why her work was unfinished. And actually, I never think that her work is unfinished. It's just not put into that kind of formula with editing where you can distribute it and make money off of it and sell it. I never use the word unfinished for anything that she's ever done, because what that would mean is that she'd have to assemble it and cut it and sell it. So remember, we had that argument about that, Renata, when we were in San Francisco with the late Annette Michelson. Remember that?
Remind us.
Well, it was in regards to the Haitian footage. The question was put about why she didn't, quote unquote, finish that, and I had the same argument then, that it was finished to the extent of she had achieved what she had set out to do, to film these ceremonies in Haiti over an 8-day period, and there was no way you could edit it. And then Michelson interrupted and he said, well, the question was put to me too, and I think that her footage was a preparation for some sort of a film. Though that's the way she spoke.
Yeah.
But
I'll never forget that.
Because she was, a renowned NYC professor. So
yeah, Annette was one of my professors at NYU. She could be tyrannical. She was brilliant, and I learned a lot from her. But
I learned that from her too. At that symposium that she could be like that. But
she was. Yeah, it was. I hated that got argumentative. I mean, because to my mind, if you love Darren, I think we should all just celebrate Darren, and we can have differences of opinion, but it's possible to disagree without being disagreeable.
Absolutely, and there is territorialism going on with the Haitian footage, for example, with Martina Kudlicek and company and Anthology. There's all of this, like who does it belong to, and who. Martina at one point was going to finish the film that Darren never finished, and the territorialism I really dislike, and I experienced that for the first time in San Francisco at that symposium. I agree with you, Renata, that she belongs to us, she belongs to the world, and for that matter, if you want to put a soundtrack on YouTube, go ahead. But
Yeah.
I don't know. It's too bad that it becomes like that. But you
Yeah.
work with someone for a long time and you feel like you own them, but you don't. You don't own the artist, and the
No.
artist belongs to us.
Well, was Divine Horseman, did she set out to make a documentary, or was that done later without? No,
Oh, heavens
She did.
knows.
no, that's what.
Well, she was going to make an experimental film. She was going to
Yeah.
work with Gregory Bateson, and she had studied his Balinese footage. And she was
In
going to make
fact, they
a
gave the footage to him.
exactly. She was going to make a film with the Balinese footage, Southwest American Indians, and Haitian Rudun ceremonies. That's before she knew anything about Rudun. And she really
And secular New York children's secular games.
Exactly.
So she was going to make this film. She called it I always call it the Visual Fugue Project. So she was going to make this experimental film that intercut religious Balinese and Haitian Vodun rituals and the secular rituals of children at play.
Mhm.
And then when she got down to Haiti, she just was so captivated by Vodun that she tossed out that visual fugue idea and wanted to make some documentaries on Vodun. She wanted to represent it, and she came back to the United States and became a spokesperson trying to redress everybody's misconceptions about Vodun as voodoo, hocus pocus, and she was never able to finish those 4 films. She had made a proposal, right, Maura, of like 4 short docs on different rituals, but she was never able to get the funding together to finish those projects.
So whose
Well,
idea?
she did get the funding before she went. She got the Guggenheim, and she had that idea to make it. But the thing is that when she got to Haiti, she realized she could not make an artistic film about these people because they were real.
Right.
And she studied, or she observed, not studied, and she was part of them. She was a participant in it. And so, like, the film that would have come out of that would have been the footage that she shot with the music that she recorded, but it wouldn't have been a documentary like with a National Geographic voiceover, which
Right.
is turned out to be after her death by
Right.
Teji and Cheryl Ito. She never
Right.
would have made a film like that.
That's right. Yeah. So the documentary that we have, Divine Horseman, it's Darren's footage, but she would never have put it together that way.
And some of the words are hers too, from her
Right.
mantra.
From her book.
So was this done by her?
They did the best they could, but according to Jonas Mekas, they cut into the work print and they altered the order that it was in, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
I've studied the footage. Now you can't study it at all because Anthology is in the process of digitizing it. But I looked at it many times on the Steenbeck editing table, and I saw it projected. And that footage is amazing.
Amazing footage. Yeah.
Well, whose
Oh,
idea?
and-
Whose idea was it to make it into that documentary? Was it her estate?
Well, they,
Oh.
so
Husband.
Ito,
Oh, her husband at the time of her death.
right.
Yeah.
So her 4th husband, the 3rd husband, sorry.
And I think
Ito was married.
and
40
he did the score for one of her later films too.
Yeah, so Bardaki was her 1st husband, Hamid was her 2nd husband, and Teji Ito was her 3rd husband.
And they all involve different epics in her creativity, because it's like the thing, like,
Yeah.
oh, she's such a, so many marriages, but they all were part of her evolution. Hamid with the filmmaking,
right.
and Bardik with the, the political consciousness, and then Teji
Right.
with music, because she also played music. She
Right.
with him, they did seminars together on music.
Correct. So after she died in 1961, when did they find that footage? It had to have been in the 70s. Ito remarried, and Cheryl Ito was his Cheryl. I can't remember her maiden name. It began with a W. Winnick or something like that. So anyway,
It's Linux.
Winnick.
Yeah.
they found this footage, Dan.
Yeah.
They found the footage that she had shot. They found it in these coffee cans in the closet and of the apartment, and that's, I guess, when they decided that they would try to put it together.
But weren't they coffee cans in the closet? I know she kept them in the closet, but weren't they at the Natural History Museum? It was given to Margaret Mead first, and then she didn't know what to do with it, and then she gave it to the experimental film organization.
Cheryl told me that they were in the coffee cans. So
Really?
Cheryl said that to me.
So then they didn't go from Natural History Museum to the distributor that Anthology later took over.
I guess not.
That's the very interesting part of the story.
So let me just talk a little bit about a couple of observations that I have as someone who is not a Deren scholar, and then we'll pause and then we'll talk about the main Maya Deren filmography. One of the things that I noticed, you mentioned the Imagist poetry, and I don't know how well versed either of you two are in later poetry that came after Imagism and in the second half of the century. But one of the things with the Imagists, oftentimes the imagery as that movement died out got a bit more cloying. And one of the things that's interesting about Deren's imagery is that it doesn't dwell on sort of faux emotionalism. And I don't know, have you ever heard of a poet named Lorin Neidecker? Because she was a Wisconsin poet from the 30s to the 80s, I think, when she died. And she wrote these little poems that are just really get down to the nub of images on a single line. And so I was just wondering if maybe she had been influenced by Deren, I don't know. But the two painters that come to mind for me when I think of Deren's work are Edward Hopper, who is certainly, I think, someone who, with those people with the blackened eyes looking off in the distance. And then later on, Andrew Wyeth. When I think of some of the images from At Land, and even from some of the one where the guy is doing 13 minutes of doing the violence, the meditation on violence. Yeah, that when I think of some of, especially the natural images, not necessarily the human portraits that Wyeth did, they really, it seems like she must have, I don't know, was she a fan of painters like Hopper? Because Wyeth probably came after her time, but
I never read
no?
read her say anything about Hopper or Wyeth.
No.
You, Maura?
Nope.
No.
I love Hopper.
Yeah.
Actually, I think he's wonderful.
Did she ever mention influences from other visual arts other than film, and who so? If so, no.
But not from painting.
No.
Nope.
So before I get into the main 5 or 6 films that she's most well known for, I did want to bring up 2 points. The first point and just to stick with poetry, the English poet John Keats, and I've mentioned this a few times over the years in shows, came up with an idea called negative capability, whereas a great artist can take two seemingly diametrically opposed things or ideas, put them together in some work of art, and then it seems natural to anyone who comes and experiences that art afterward that it couldn't be anything other than that. And that's sort of this ability that a great artist has. And I think that Maya Deren certainly has that in some of the images, starting from Meshes through At Land and some of the later films. I'm wondering if either of you, even if you didn't know the term, if that resonates with you, that the way that she will bring things together in the films. Either one of you.
She doesn't like the word great artist. Yeah. The word, sorry, she didn't like that. But she actually, like Ingmar Bergman, really saw the artist as an afflicted person by the public. And I felt like the way that artists are treated in society was demeaning, and how they're, trotted out for exhibitions on Sunday and whatever. She wrote about it in, I think it was the introduction to Divine Horseman that she wrote about that.
She wrote about the artist as, or she believed the artist had this ability to see through the fog, kind of. That's not the term she used, but that the sensitive artist is able to see see through the veil to see things as they are.
And that's why she was chosen by Joseph Campbell to write about it in Divine Horseman, because she had that sensibility. And that's why the Haitians appreciated her and considered her camera as an intrinsic part of their ceremonies because of the reverence that she had towards cinema as an art instrument and as a spiritual transformative tool.
So as we head, let's talk about meshes. And what comes to me is that it seems to me that there's a good deal of influence that she must have seen German expressionist films, and particularly one film that sticks out in my mind is Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire, because there are a few scenes in meshes with Hamid, who Hamid looks eerily like the main actor who plays a character called David Gray in Vampire. And then there's some scenes of, for example, from where the character of Gray in Dreyer's film is in a coffin with a glass plate looking out, and you see the world from his point of view. This strikes me as very Darren-like. Was she a fan, or was she influenced by German expressionism, and or what was her opinion of Dreyer? No?
Go ahead.
I think she did know of Dreyer's work. I don't know whether or not she had ever seen Vampire, but remember, Hamid was from Czechoslovakia, and he was an experimental filmmaker and a documentary filmmaker in the 30s already. My guess is, you're right to refer to that sort of expressionist aesthetic, the use of chiaroscuro and the use of shadow. I mean, the protagonist in Meshes of the Afternoon, we don't see her at first. We see her shadow and the beautiful play of black and white and the use of chiaroscuro and the female, the body, the shadow on the wall before she even goes into the house. We don't see her. And so, I think they must have also been aware of surrealist work by, Buñuel and Dali, and that is such an Homeric film.
Yeah. Well, and also the Joan of Arc film Dreyer did. And Dreyer also did do experimental films and documentary films too at some points. But anyway, so let's talk about Meshes then. So this is her first fully realized film. It's only about, 14, 15 minutes. And so if either one of you want to talk about where she got the idea, how she filmed it, and then we'll talk about the substance of the film, whichever one of you wants to take that.
Well, it was in Hollywood. They were, they were living in Los Angeles and Hollywood, and they shot it at their house. The road around which the mysterious figure disappears, that was their driveway. I don't know, Maura, do you want to talk about that? I don't know whether or not we have any evidence of what inspired her to make a film about. I mean, we can read the blurbs, what she wrote about her films, and and that she talks about it as a nightmare affecting the reality of this protagonist. But why she made a film about 3 dream girls who conspire to kill this person, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that it was a film that the two of them made together. It was a collaborative project, and she had thought out the story in advance, and they shot it. And since it was her first film, it was pretty successful, I'd say, for her film. I mean, it's the film that most people seem to remember about it. It's actually the first time I saw that in the States. It was in the horror section of Tower Records.
Really?
Yeah, her films were in the horror section of Tower Records.
Wow.
Because that, I don't know, like you're talking about vampires.
Yeah.
And no, I have nothing. I think you should read the shooting script of the film that's in Legend of Maya Deren, but I know nothing what they set down, although I was thinking of this. Nothing, I don't have anything to add on that.
No, we, you know, and Maura and I, having done our dissertations on it, we read everything that Darren wrote. And so the shooting scripts, what you see is what you get. And if there was anything that said, I've got this idea for a movie about, but she didn't, there isn't any evidence.
She didn't think like that. Like, she didn't think like a filmmaker, and she didn't think about influences like we think about that. Who are your influences? What's your next project? She didn't think like that because she was an artist and she was using film as a creative medium. And she didn't think in commercial terms, and she didn't, follow the trajectory of famous people, although she knew famous people. But I don't think, they were her friends because they were famous. They were her friends because she just had met them, not because they were famous.
Well,
she'd had dinner parties, and there was this little etching. You probably saw that at Boston, Renata, of this party that I don't know if it was Andre Breton that was there or one of his mentors, one of his proteges.
It was Breton.
It was Breton. And Charles Duit, who was one of his students, Duits. You know him?
No.
You never read about him because he was also a symbolist.
Ah.
Yeah.
So would a term, for example, from what you're saying as a filmmaker, if she didn't have a working script, she was going on instinct. Would a term like pragmatic visionary be applicable to her, do you think?
She didn't go on instinct. She had a shooting script.
Oh yeah,
yeah. What
she pre-planned
everything.
Everything. I mean, but
that's why the shooting scripts are important.
Yeah. So but we don't have any written explanation of where the idea came from of having a person come, you've got the shooting script. She needed to articulate the shooting script, and actually a continuity script, because she needed to put that together in the late 50s for Teji to do the score. Mm-hmm. But she meticulously pre-planned. She believed in she had this phrase that true art is the result of a conscious manipulation of one's material from an intensely motivated point of view. So she had these ideas. She, Hammett taught her about the camera, the motion picture camera. She'd already been doing still photography, as Maura said. And the ideas behind meshes were hers. I mean, Hammett talks about that. Miriam Arsham, who helped with the cutting, talks about that too. Hella Heyman, who ended up marrying Hammett after Maya and Hammett got divorced, also worked with her on films. All of them say the ideas were Maya's.
Yeah. So the provenance, though, of the ideas we don't know of. She didn't leave any clues, which is a good thing, because
not for this one.
People often can't.
The script is a clue. I think that it's self-explanatory. That meticulously planned. I mean, that's it. She created this art form. She created this art project, and she followed a plan.
Right.
I mean, should there be more? Should she have thought about it? The difference between horizontal and vertical, Renata, that she talks about.
Oh my God, these wonderful metaphors that she came up with, Dan. So what Maura is referring to is she used these metaphors of vertical and horizontal structure, mm-hmm. and she gets horizontal. The metaphor of horizontal structure is linear or chronological narrative that unfolds across actions across space, versus the vertical investigation of an emotion or an idea in time. Yeah. So it's the distinction, and she saw everything in terms of vertical and horizontal structures. The crossroads. Pardon?
She was a vertical artist.
That's right.
Not a horizontal one.
No, but she used those metaphors all the time to make that distinction. So her work consists of these cinepoems that are vertical investigations of emotions and ideas. And I think what Maura and I are both trying to say, we've got the film, we've got Meshes of the Afternoon, and you look at Meshes of the Afternoon, and it's this beautifully constructed film art object that is exemplary of modernist ambiguity and abstraction, and exactly what she believed in, that the work of film art should be this consciously manipulated um, treatment of space-time, transformation of space-time into a new whole. Like Maura said earlier, she didn't want to just represent reality. She wanted the work of art to present something new, to transform space-time. And she was this moral, her aesthetics and her ethics were also intertwined. She felt that the audience's engagement with this new thing, this gestalt, would help them learn and grow.
Well, the use of repetition, which seemed to be a good example of this vertical art, because just as the old saying is, you can't step into the same river twice. You can run the same 5 or 10-second clip of a guy swinging a samurai sword around or whatnot, but it's not going to have the same impact because it has been dislocated in time. It comes after the first one, and let's say if it's being run backwards, it's going to have an impact some way different than the first time you see it.
And yeah, and each of the repetitions, are there's the cinema studies term repetition with difference, right? Each entrance of a dream girl, the objects, the telephone, the knife, the flower, they're in different locations. So she's playing in very oniric fashion with all of these objects in that space.
But I do remember one thing she did write about, and I'm not sure if it was Meshes or Atland, that she felt that she wanted to go through the wall. She wanted to break the wall. She felt that there should be a passageway that there wasn't. And when I explained this to this professor from Germany, Peter Weibel, he has an Institute for New Media Research. I don't know if he's still alive or if he still has it, but he said, it sounds like Maya Deren was working in the wrong medium. She should have been working in virtual reality, especially her situation with Haiti, where she just felt like it was so flat and three-dimensional. It was very difficult to make a film of something that she was experiencing at a tactile level. So I do remember that standing out as far as not part of the shitting script, that there was a wall that was solid that she felt that she should be able to go to and could go through and couldn't in the film medium.
Well, it's interesting because for me, I come from writing background in poetry specifically, but there's a term in poetry called anaphora. If you read Walt Whitman's poetry, and he starts off a line with, and then
Right.
this happened, and then, or Carl Sandburg. It seems to me that a lot of times you'll get that direct repetition followed by a different shot. You go back to the repetition, there's something else. So you get this sort of pulsing beat, it's like a heartbeat, but it's always changed, not only because of time, but in how how the things are coming together. Like I said, with that putting different things together negatively capable, as John Keats would say. So I'm looking at it from as a visual poesy.
And that's, for me, I mean, there are lots of different ways to look at a work of art. And, you have an artist here in Maya Deren who absolutely had intention. And she absolutely wanted people to understand her films in terms of her authorial intention. And she wrote, volumes explaining the way she felt you should look at her work. But you can't, once a work of art is out there, you can't limit the way somebody looks at it. And you bring your own experiences and your own understanding and your own learning to the work. And to me, that's what's kind of wonderful about works of modernist art, because they are so open to a multiplicity of views and attitudes and readings.
So the following year, 1944, she goes across the country to do the second film, At Land, which she films on Long Island. And that's, to me, as I said, I actually think this is a better film than Meshes. We won't argue about it, but the reason I think it's better is there is a little bit less of the obvious symbolism that I think is in Meshes, and it seems to be come more naturally. It seems more actually oniric in terms of its repetitions. That it seems to be smoother. I almost think of like those shows where you see a wood carver carving, and then he's taking the sand. It seems like she sanded this film a little bit more than she did the first one. Either one of you, if you want to talk about At Land, where it came from, and
well, Hammond Hammond got a job with the Office of War Information, and that's why they moved to New York. So they were living in the West Village, and that when we went out to Long Island to shoot that film, and for me, I don't want to talk about better or worse, but because I love them all. And I absolutely love, for me, at Land, the title At Land is her play on words, the phrase being at sea. And so you've got, this idea of being confused. And so this character who goes through this odyssey, this journey, I think it absolutely is oniric. And I love the oniric treatment of space-time in the film. I think it's great fun.
Speaking of repetition, I see a lot of repetition, and that word is sticking in my mind that you bring up, Dan, because you've got this walk along this lane, or these three guys that change position, but they're going on the same walk. Mm-hmm. And also, it's like this juxtaposition of nature and urban environment, like crawling through the sea drift and the seaweed on the beach, and then crawling the length of the dinner table, where people are having intellectual discussions and smoking.
And ignoring her.
Yeah. Right. And then this chess piece that just follows through the whole film, and the chess game, which has been now this has nothing to do with her, but she got really pissed off about it. There was an interpretation of the chess game where she steals or appropriates a chess piece from these two women playing the game. And she's stroking their hair as she she's distracting them by stroking their hair. And a German film critic, Petra Weiss, called it the lesbian scene. Oh. And so she wrote back. She didn't need to, but she wrote back and she said, well, I'm not a lesbian, but certainly this cannot be misconstrued as a lesbian. It's still referred to as the lesbian scene. It's so unbelievable. Yeah. So that's extra. That's not in the film, but she did actually respond to it. She often wrote letters to the editor about her films, promoting her films, etc. She was a really great self-promoter.
Right.
In reading some of the criticism of At Land, as opposed to Meshes, where you have a beginning and an end, and there seems to be at least the push forward in time. I've read that some critics think that the film itself, At Land, is just a gigantic loop, that as she runs off into the end, she comes back up onto the beach. I don't buy that, but did any of that? Have you ever read any of that kind of criticism?
She ran off. She didn't come back to the beach. She ran off. That's the last scene.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't
back to the beach.
I don't see how she's
gone.
Yeah. I think it's a wonderful ending. She steals the White Queen chess piece. It's very mischievous, and she runs down the beach. This character, the protagonist, that Darren portrays, but of course it's not her. She's just acting because who would be able to portray this figure as well as she. She's like this amphibious creature who washes up on the beach, and she's already playing with time because it's in reverse motion. And then again, a very creative manipulation of space time when she's crawling up the driftwood, and then through some bushes, and then on the table, and back and forth, and then what do you think, Maura? I can't decide whether or not the chess pieces move on their own, or is she, when she's looking, is she making them move, or is she following their movement? Either way,
They're
it's still,
moving.
yeah. And then when the pawn falls down, the white pawn falls down, and then we cut to this other wonderful transition from an interior to an exterior space. The pawn falls through a hole in a rock formation on the beach, and then it's really the then she's off to the races, and then that wonderful walk down the lane where the man she's speaking to changes thrice. I mean, this is
Arthur Tyler and
Yeah.
her husband and
and
John
Campbell,
So,
John Cage.
John Cage.
Yeah. so
You know what? Speaking of which, this I do know from her original script that she didn't use, that the film was about checkmate in 26 moves.
What is it?
Yeah, that's
But I mean, it's like it's the character is like Alice in Wonderland, right? Going through these places that metamorphose, people and places metamorphose without warning. But this character is moxie, just like Alice, and mischievously steals the White Queen, and that's the way. I mean, the game of chess was important to Lewis Carroll as well, and that's the chess game structure is the structure of Through the Looking Glass.
yeah, that's an
it
interesting.
can also be the patriarchal order too, because as meshes,
Yeah,
she's the man that's under the white sheet in that room out as she enters the hut. I mean, that is so amazing, that part. Who is this guy? I thought it was Salvador Dali, but
no,
Okay.
just a mustache. That was on the first screening, but it's like she is like, it's not just that she's going back and forth between nature and urban environments, but she's going through consciousness states too that are represented by these people. Like the fact that she would walk down a lane with a well-known film critic and a well-known experimental musician, and Alexander Hammond, who was at the time an experimental filmmaker. It's not just those two planes that she's going back and forth. So it's very, very interesting film.
I think so too. And the Meshes and Atland and Ritual and Transfigured Time, they present really problematic heterosexual relationships, right? I mean, in that walk down the lane, but even if you didn't know that was Hammond, the last person who ends up walking fast, they seem to have an argument. He's walking faster. She can't keep up. He walks into the house, without her. I mean, there are troubled relationships. We haven't started to talk about Ritual and Transfigured Time too, but there's, this relationship between the Rita Christiani character and the Frank Westbrook character that starts out seemingly romantic, and then she's scared of him and runs away, and then there's this wonderful doubling, another very Oneric technique of split or doubled selves, that Darren and Christiani kind of share in being this character who runs away from this man. So I think you have it. That's right there in the footage. You can't kind of deny it.
But that film, I do have to say that the shooting script that she did not use explains a lot of those shots. I mean, the fear and the terror, because I can't recall, I don't have a photographic memory, but as I said, I did explain it in detail in the new Blu-ray by Chino Lorber, what was contained in that. And it does explain some of the looks of fear that's not necessarily is not from the male and female relationship, but she has a doll and some objects are being thrown at a doll, and there's all kinds of things in it that, because it was called Ritual and Ordeal at first.
Originally, right.
And then it changed to this Ritual with Rita Christiani and
Ritual and Transfigured Time. And I wonder, Maura, what you think about this. So yeah, it was called Ritual and Ordeal, and the character is going through an ordeal. Um, but maybe she changed the title to give the title over to Creative Cinematic Method. It is transfigured. She is dealing with creative treatment of space-time once again. So maybe that's why. It's just a thought. And maybe
I also see this film and the subsequent films as what's happening to her because of Haiti. Because, I mean, there is the scene where she descends into the water, which Jane Campion has used.
Right, in the piano.
Many filmmakers have used that scene, that descent into the abyss, which in Haitian mythology is where the gods live, the deity, the Loa. So I think, and then Rita Christiani was from Trinidad, and she had worked with Catherine Dunham by this time. So I think there is a crossover that's going on in consciousness with her interest in ritual, which is why the name was changed also to Transfigured Time, Ritual and Transfigured Time, from Ritual and Ordeal. And there's also the Norns are in that, as I started to say, the Moray, which are like the Moray, the Greek goddess that plants the seed, spins the cloth, and cuts the cloth. That was the third part. Oh, I got it all mixed up.
Well, that's also the film where the supposed statue comes to life.
Right.
Yes,
And that
exactly.
And actually, it's funny because just this past a week or so ago, I watched an old Ray Harryhausen film where a statue comes to life too, and it's very interesting to see the difference between stop motion versus her use of the real person. But Christiani is basically the main character in that film, and she seems to. Well, I'm trying to remember exactly what's the last moment of that film. How does that end versus Atland? Atland ends with Darren running off into the distance.
Right.
And how does the film?
Into water is the last scene. In reverse film, black and white.
Right, in negative.
That's right.
So Darren, Frank Westbrook is chasing Rita Christiani, and then we get to the water at the pier, and then it's Darren who moves through the water, and then Darren transforms into Christiani, and it, as Maura said, it's Christiani in negative.
Okay.
It's Christiani in negative, but it's really interesting because it's Maya and Christiani are the same. They're the same characters.
Yeah.
But that's part of the ritual. And
right. It's transformation.
Rita is spun into the ritual by the initiator, and that's Anais Nin, that's in the beginning of the film, standing in the doorway.
Right.
And it's a very interesting film. There's so much.
Yeah. So it ends, Dan, to answer your question, with this negative imagery of the woman, the Rita Christiani character.
Darren.
It's Christiani who descends into the water, but
they're the same.
But they are the same, right?
They
are one and the same.
When she turns, she's Rita in some shots, and then she's Maya. I mean,
exactly.
Like the same. They're a composite whole.
And
it
basically,
it
basically foreshadows the Eye of Night that she did later on. And since we talked quite a bit about Ritual and Transfigured Time, let's just back up here to the film that came between that and Atland, which is a study in choreography for camera, which is only a 3-minute film, and then we get the later Meditation on Violence, which is about 4 times as long. Was it the same dancer in both films?
Oh no.
No.
Tally Beatty was the dancer in choreography for camera, and a man by the name of Chow Li Chi was the martial art dancer in Meditation on Violence.
So after Meshes and Atland, though, it seems that 3-minute film seems just sort of like what was
it was. So here's my take on it, and more chime in. So the full name of the film was A Study in Choreography for Camera, And in music, the term etude means a study.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the definition of the term. Etude is study, right? And when you're talking about an etude in music, it's a short musical piece that is written as an exercise, so that you can practice technique. So I think that Darren calls this film a study in choreography for camera because she has this idea of creative filmmaking as the combination of the movement of the human form, the dancer. So it's a dance. She's creating a dance through the combination of human movement and the movement of the camera and of the editing bench. And there are all these ways you take advantage of the capabilities of the motion picture medium through its ability to creatively manipulate space-time, fast motion, slow motion, reverse motion, and editorially juxtapose spaces that wouldn't otherwise be contiguous. And she was using that film as an exercise in creative cinematic form.
Now, oftentimes painters do studies for larger works. Was this study then a study that led to meditation?
No, it
No.
didn't actually. And I do want to add to you, I agree with your interpretation, but I do want to say that this study in choreography for camera was about one continuous movement. And that's why she was very concerned with the editing of it. Why it would be useful to a film student, how she gets that one continuous movement that's moving through different spaces.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't a preparation for something bigger.
No.
But it did, and it encapsulated at that time how she was thinking about film, which plays completely into how important ritual is for her, because rituals are supposed to be are not supposed to, but are depersonalized forms. And she felt that this short film was also a deep, that again, it was a vertical investigation. It wasn't a film that was telling a horizontal linear narrative across space. It was really this investigation of this exercise in creative movement.
This exercise is used in almost all of her films, and that's why they're called dance films. And she was given this designation by this New York Times writer that was called choreo cinema. She didn't call it herself. Mm-hmm. But I mean, she did. I mean, she was very successful in showing the body, especially the body in reverence to principal dance, which no one had done before. So, I mean, she said this was so distinct from a ballet or you're watching a performance and someone is clapping in the background. And actually, Gene Kelly had consulted her in her use of choreo cinema, although he never used any of her techniques. There was never any evidence of this, continuous movement through editing of the body. The mobile body in motion is what I think she's most known for. And of course, you see that the tour de force that you're not going to talk about is the Haitian footage. That's where you actually really see how that no one ever gets in the way of her camera because her camera is mobile. So when an object is moving, the camera is moving and she's moving. It's so wonderful to see that. It's so wonderful to see that completion. And this is she's making these films in the 50s. So much later, after these so-called finished films, that she had really improved on the style that we see in evidence in a study in choreography for camera.
Yeah, and right. That footage is very different because she doesn't want to manipulate she's using slow motion a lot and moving camera a lot when she's recording the Vodun rituals. When she was writing Anagram, she talked about her about choreography for camera. I mean, she really felt that film art should what the artist needed to create was movement and that couldn't exist outside of its filmic representation.
Now,
So-
That, yeah.
with,
So that's, so you can't, she didn't, she did not feel, she loved the term choreo cinema or cine dance. I mean, later on, she referred to all of her films as choreographies for camera, and then started to call the study in choreography for camera as pas de deux, to make a distinction between this overarching label that she was giving her films. She really felt that, you needed to take advantage of the cinematic medium, and your films should not just be a recording of a dance performance on the stage. And I think that's why, mostly the critics are more critical of meditation on violence. And I think because with meditation on violence, she ignored her own, I think, really crucial aesthetic. And so Chao Li Chi she's mostly recording Chao Li Chi and doing a little bit of, matches on action. That's the kind of editorial technique that she's using, where sometimes he's going to start a leap in front of the white wall and then end that leap in front of a black wall, and then he ends up being outside. But basically she also said she wanted to have the camera for that film more as the observer. And
then she had also been in Haiti, and that's where it started with the camera, so to speak, as observer. But I do want to say that her planning, remember, she planned all her films in advance.
Right.
That this film was supposed to be a reenactment of the continuous whole, the figure eight
right.
eternity. I mean, and that's what he's doing with the forward movement of the Wudang, and then the backward movement of the Shaolin.
Yeah.
And vice versa, that
Yeah.
it is one continuous movement. Actually, when you see it that way, with that one break in the middle with the Shaolin
With the freeze frame.
sword, and
Yeah.
why she did that. Well, there were probably practical reasons why she did that, but
Maybe.
I don't see that so. And I know Jonas Mekas didn't like that film either, and he said that her film started being less interesting from that point on. And I actually think that is a very interesting film, because of how she used movement and how she used, because he's in principled state. He is doing dance and reverence to deity with those two
Those
Chinese
movements.
art forms. He is.
Um,
And also there's the Haitian drums that come in, that she's using that in the background when she gets to the Shaolin or the Wudang. I always get them confused. The peaceful.
Shaolin is first.
Right.
Wu-Tang is first, and then Shaolin. Yeah.
Right.
Shaolin is with the sword.
Okay, so she is bringing in the Haitian music at that point, and at that point she is in Haiti. In her mom.
I think you're absolutely right. That's that kind of, you just help make the penny drop for me on that, because so that more observational treatment of the subject makes more sense, knowing that she has this different idea about about once she falls in love with Vodun down in Haiti, that's going to change.
And also because she's abandoning her artistic manipulations when she's down in Haiti.
Right.
And that's not in this film. There's no, like trying to juxtapose something, like trying to get those children's games going with the Southwest Indians with the voodoo. I mean, that whole part she lets go of, and she lets everything be on its ritual intent.
Right. She wants to preserve the integrity of the ritual.
Yes, exactly.
So I did want to ask, though, about meditation on violence. Having watched it 2 or 3 times, some people have said, is it actually that at the midpoint it actually is all going backward? Because it doesn't seem to me to be. Is it an actual the same exact amount of time?
It is going in reverse. You watch. Yeah. It's subtle, but if you watch, he's got this, I don't know, I'm going to call it a bandana, and Maura, I don't know if that's the right term, but what he's got tied around his head, you can tell it's very subtle that, that it will move before he does. And that's how that the temporal movement is in reverse.
Yeah.
So look at his sash. Watch it again, and look at that bandana, and look at his sash. After that midpoint, after the freeze frame, then all the movement is in reverse.
That's the key, the bandana.
So we mentioned The Very Eye of Night, and I found this to be both, in some ways, her pushing farther than she had before, but in other ways, I found that film to be less satisfying than some of than Meshes or Atland or a couple of the other ones we've mentioned, and I think it's because maybe it's because I've seen that in other people later on, whereas oddly enough, her earlier stuff still seems more fresh, whereas the later stuff seems to have been copied more by other avant-garde filmmakers. Talk to me about that film, what she was trying to do, because that's about 14, 15 minutes too, so it's one of her quote-unquote longer films. But what was she trying to do there with I think it's virtually all negatives. It's all shot in negative.
Yeah, it is. And I do want to say also go back to, this is when she's totally immersed in Haitian mythology. And this film is really about that when they're in the sky, they're in with the Loa, even though they're...
she doesn't refer to those characters that way.
She has names for them. There's like the satellites, and there's the Uranus.
Right, there's Gemini and Uranus and Urania and the 4 moons and...
but I think it's just like with the Ritual and Transfigured Time, with the descent into the water and negative film, that she's using this now more and more, because for her consciousness, because when you're an artist, you're not thinking of emulating some other artist when you're making your project. You're emulating, whatever in your consciousness. So this was in her consciousness. She was very, very steeped in Haitian mythology at this point. And also, it took 7 years for that film to get released. And there was also some problems in getting released.
Sure, with her. It has a torture.
I think that film is really about Haitian mythology. And that's why it's all in negative. And so I can't really compare it to her other films, because I know it's going through them. And I know Stan Brakhage would disagree with that, because he seems to think that her art was destroyed when she went to Haiti. And there's many people who think that. But I think it only deepened and became enriched by her experiences in Haiti and mythology.
I love The Very Eye of Night too, and I'd never, what she writes about it, in terms of these mythological characters, and she writes about it in terms of, she hopes that the viewer sees day and night as opposites of each other, and once again, she had intention, but whether or not you can read her intention from your experience of the film, to me, it's celestial bodies. I absolutely get the idea of celestial bodies traversing across space. And, and it's, I love the engagement and the emotional experience that it gives me. And I think that those experiences are going to be different for different people. If you don't know anything about Haitian Vodun, that's not what you're going to see in this film. But for if you know something, even if and she's got this really elaborate opening credit sequence that says who are the performers and what their role is, and she wants it to be understood as these beautiful orbits of our night journeys. And again, I think what she writes about is poetry. I mean, how she writes about the film is poetic. And whether or not you get her ideas out of it, that's, wonderful. If you get some of her ideas, or none or all, or you bring your own understanding to it, it either works for you or it doesn't. It can't speak to anybody else, right? If Brakhage didn't like it, okay.
I agree with that, but there is this consensus among some critics looking at these films, beginning with Meshes, that her films are in this ready-made trance trans film genre,
Trans
which
films,
I also
yeah.
disagree with, and also they liken that to her going to Haiti, and there's a lot of prejudice against Haitian voodoo. Also, it's very racist. Some of the prejudices. I've been in discussions where people have brought that up before, and her films weren't about trans. They were about alternate states. Like when she wants to go through that world that she can't go through, that's not about being in a trance. And so likewise, when she went to Haiti, that wasn't, these films weren't a preparation for being in a trance. And then also like the misconceptions about zombie, that she's a trance walker, and ensemble for some somnambulist, that's a very difficult word to pronounce, was a predecessor to Very Eye of Night. And a somnambulist, a sleepwalker, is very different from somebody who is practicing Haitian voodoo or is dancing in reverence to deity. So it's hard for me to read this stuff. I find these interpretations very naive and very unskilled.
Let me just ask about her writing. So I know she wrote a bit about the current film state in America. This was the Hollywood of where Hitchcock's films were big, where John Wayne was at his apex during the 40s and 50s. What was her take on then contemporaneous Hollywood critically?
Well, she wasn't, she wasn't a fan. As I said before, there were some films. She liked Hollywood movies as escapist entertainment. She liked, I love, do you remember this, Maura? She says in Anagram, she likes the early Greta Garbo.
Reading silent.
Yeah. So, I think she, her ideas about film art were so at the other end of the spectrum from Hollywood filmmaking that, she wasn't a fan. And she talks about how, there were a number of authors who went to Hollywood and became screenwriters, like Dashiell Hammett, for example, or James M. Cain. And she felt that they had prostituted themselves, for Hollywood, to Hollywood. So
she didn't really write much about Hollywood, and I brought that up horizontal. She wasn't really interested in the horizontal filmmaking,
exactly.
But I'm sure that she enjoyed a Hollywood film like anybody else.
Yeah.
And she'd like to say, that her films cost what Hollywood spends on lipstick. Yeah. I like that quote. And
I do too.
She made this mentions of the afternoon of 1943 in Hollywood as, kind of a thumbs up thumbs down to Hollywood. Like, this is what you can do in Hollywood that's not Hollywood. So, but she wasn't polemical about it. She didn't really talk about it. I mean, like, she did her own thing. She talked about what she was interested in. And
that's right. And she wrote published articles about creative filmmaking. And, she writes about, very critically, but briefly, about Hollywood in an anagram of ideas on art form and film. And that's what she basically says, that's not the quote that Maura just said, I make my films for what Hollywood spends on lipstick was, a wonderful pull quote from an interview with her for like a movie making magazine for amateurs or something. Amateur film.
So I want to talk about her death because in looking over and just reading a bit about it, for someone who is against Hollywood, it seems she had that very kind of almost Hollywood ending death, in that it reminds me of Michael Jackson because, there was the doctor who had was prescribing her pills, and apparently he had a bad reputation.
Max Jacobson.
Yeah,
Kennedy's doctor.
Yeah. A lot of Benzedrine shots.
So was she hooked on these drugs, or
she took Benzedrine because she hated to. Pardon?
She called them vitamin shots.
Vitamin shots, right?
Jacobson's vitamin shots.
She hated. Sasha described her as a woman who hated to waste time sleeping, and she, would stay up for days when she was working on a project, and the way she did that was, speed.
I don't think she thought she was taking speed. I think she actually, that came about working with Catherine Dunham,
Right, that's when it started.
her dancers. Like, that's how it actually came about to
That's exactly
keep
right.
going in work. And I don't think she thought she was taking speed. I think she thought she was taking vitamin injections.
To keep herself away.
Yeah, or healthy or whatever.
Yeah.
A
So
lot
was
of
it,
people trusted him.
was her
So
death
she
was her death
sorry?
accidental then?
She died of multiple cerebral hemorrhages, Barry aneurysms, and they may have been there congenitally. One of my former housemates when I lived in Boston was a medical intern, and thanks to the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get her the medical records from the hospital.
Really?
Yeah. So I showed that to my housemate, and I said, look, she was a smoker and she drank and she was taking speed, and could that have caused this? And he said no, that the given what they said on the medical report, that it's very possible that it was that it was there, it was just waiting to explode, and that's what happened. I mean, she just felt like something exploded in her head, and then she suffered for 2 weeks in the hospital before she died.
So let me just talk.
Cerebral hemorrhages usually happen to very intellectual people. And, I do want to say that it was accidental too. And I know there's a lot of mythology about her death, and I actually hate talking about that. There's so much you can read about that. I don't think it was a Hollywood death. I think it was the death of an artist who started off using what she thought were vitamin injections when working with Catherine Dunham, was on tour, and all of her dancers used it, and it became a way of life for her, and it taught her. And she certainly didn't plan it.
No, she suffered.
So let's talk about her legacy as it is today. But before we do that, I want to just ask, where do you think she would have evolved as a filmmaker had she lived to be in her 70s or 80s?
Who knows?
I don't know.
She just kept on going. She would have probably going into new vistas because she was working on a circus film. That's one of her incomplete films towards the end of her life.
Right.
She was always interested in different kinds of ideas. It's really fun to read her so-called unfinished, her ideas, her sketches for new films. She just would have continued to evolve artistically.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if she would have, she would have. I would have loved to have seen what she would have cut together of the Haitian footage, and my sense is, I don't know. Again, we're just spitballing here, but I think she probably would have continued to make Homeric films, just because I think that I can't. I do agree that she wanted to continue to evolve, but I cannot imagine her shifting away from the kind of films that we, of Meshes and Atland and Ritual. I think there would have been like two camps that she would have, if she stayed in love with Beaudoin, she would have wanted to present work that honored that spiritual system, because she did honor it, and then I think that she was a dyed-in-the-wool artist, and she felt that true art is experiential, and that true film art should take advantage of the motion picture medium of the camera and the editing bench, and not just represent reality. So I think that she should continue to do that.
Besides doing films, since she was a self-promoter, and she also went around the United States doing lecture demonstrations on her film work, she might have continued with that. Maybe, actually, indirectly, our film appreciation courses come from her, because she was one of the first people to show her films and be generally interested in what young students had to say about her film. She did one such lecture demonstration at Smith College to a group of women. And all of these things were on tape. She was at Vanderbilt, and she was at
Yale and
Yeah, I mean, she might have done more of that, or she would have done that in combination with, but she was interested in film from the conception to the reception of it. She was
Yeah.
involved in every aspect of it. She would have helped young filmmakers as she started at Film
Absolutely.
Foundation. She would have continued these things that she was doing. So
I think
don't know.
absolutely she would have, she had this, Maura is just referring to the Creative Film Foundation, which, she got Joseph Campbell together, even Hammond, as well as others, even after, she and Hammond had divorced. And the whole point of the Creative Film Foundation was to support experimental artists, experimental filmmakers.
So,
Shirley Clarke was one of the first ones who did.
Shirley Clarke and Stan Brakhage and Carmen Davino and a bunch of others.
so I do know that Brakhage won an award called the Maya Deren Award. Who sponsors that?
That was well, he did get, we're not sure whether or not, right, whether or not he got the money, but the Creative Film Foundation, he won an
Was that the
award.
Mike Darren Award though, or wasn't there
It
one?
wasn't. Maybe, are you talking, Dan, about some from later? Because
Yeah, in
there
the
was-
90s. In the 90s, I think Brakhage
In the
won.
90s?
I think it was.
Maybe.
Can't
Yeah,
remember.
so maybe that's something that Anthology Film Archives
Okay.
did. That
Somebody,
maybe-
but she did that.
Yeah, but there was, the Creative Film Foundation, when did she start that? In the mid 50s, 54, I think, or something like that. And, and then of course she died in
61.
61. And so then then that, the organization ceased to function.
So, who today do you know or think a filmmaker that is sort of like the spiritual descendant of hers? Are there any 2 or 3 filmmakers that come to mind, whether American or not?
No, I think she was a one-off. I mean, lots of experimental filmmakers refer to her as an influence.
Uh-huh.
No question about it.
I want to say, and I'm just trying to think, Maria Tlandaris and Tomadaki, 2 Greek women who were in exile in Paris. I think their films were very much corporeal, working with the body in motion. And I don't know if she still is, but she was a teacher at the Sorbonne, Tomadaki, and Maria Tlandaris recently died. But those are 2 filmmakers that come to mind that are very, very close to Maya Deren, and I know Maria loved Maya Deren.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think Barbara Hammer made films anything like. She just did not make anything like Maya Deren, and she's often been put in that. I think what Barbara Hammer liked was the self-promotion aspect, because Barbara Hammer was a self-promoter, and that's how her career took off, because she knew how to talk to people and show films and get films shown, and she really evolved too. But I can't really, if I thought about it, I can actually write you a letter, Dan. I'm sure there's more people, because I see
That's
films all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I see these films at the Créteil Film de Femmes Festival in Paris. I've been going there since the 80s. That's the largest ongoing women's film festival in the world. So there are women always Maya Deren comes up all of the time.
All the time, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Because she made short films, economical films. She made her first film at 26. It's really appealing to young people.
Yeah.
And film students.
Yeah.
so actually, it was the American Film Institute in '86 that started the Maya Deren Award for indie
Okay,
filmmakers.
there was something like that.
There you go.
So let me just wrap up then. Maura, let me just ask you, is there anything that I or you have missed yet that you want to convey about Deren? And if you can give just your final summation as to why she's a great filmmaker.
Well, I don't know. I mean, as we've been talking, my final words is that, the ways that filmmakers are described are not the ways you would describe Maya Deren, that she's not in a class of her own, but there's a different way of looking at her work. And also, I don't think of her film films collectively as being, a short body of work. I think of them as a long body of work.
Rich body.
Taken over, a great many years of time and preparation. Well, I mean, I have focused a lot on the Haitian footage, and we didn't talk about that really, but I have managed to get a few things said about it. But the continuum of her work as a filmmaker, as a choreo cinema, a mobile body, up to Haiti. To see her work as a continuum instead of, oh, she did this and then she did this and this, like they're all connected. Everything about her is connected. She was very fluid in that way. And I suppose that not to, compartmentalize her work or the fact that she had 4 husbands or whatever, 3 husbands. I mean, like the multiplicity of this woman and the way she connected her work together was what was inspirational to me. And also that she could defy time and go back in time and make, artifacts, ritual artifacts that we no longer have with us, contemporary film audiences, and how she loved the film student. I think that I would want to say that, especially since she went around and I've listened to the discussions that she had. She really spoke to the student and was interested in what the student had to say about her film. That's what I would say.
I want to ask you the same thing, Renata, but before I do, I just wanted to bring up a point that just came to my mind. I'm sure you probably know of the Hungarian filmmaker Bela Tar with his long films like Satan Tango, which is a 7-hour film. And I've always thought of Maya Deren sort of as the anti-Tar, or he is the anti-Deren, in that she has these relatively short films, yet when you think of them in memory, the films seem longer. With Tar, the opposite is, you can watch a 7-hour Tar film, but your mind shrinks it down to the essentials. And both of them were playing with time sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't know. I just felt the need to say that. But if you have, Renata, if there's anything that we missed, and what is your final summation as to why Maya Deren's a great filmmaker?
I think Deren was this incredibly intelligent and creative writer and filmmaker, and she was a film theorist in the United States. She was one of the first people to be both a practitioner and a theorist in the United States, and her body of work it deserves the place within the canon of experimental filmmaking, because it is really creative. And she was a dynamo. She was so articulate. You have to take the time to either listen to those tapes of the lectures that Maura and I were saying. She spoke at Smith, she spoke at Yale, she spoke at NYU. There's the Poetry and Film Symposium from 1953.
That's a really
yeah. I mean, she was so incredibly articulate and creative, and
a woman working among men.
Exactly right.
And also her limited means of money. She was financing this all on her own. She died in poverty. I mean, it's different for women working in film than men.
That's exactly right. So I think she deserves the accolade of the mother of the American avant-garde that she is very often referred to as.
Well, I'm going to link to Maura's mayaderen.org website, as well as your university page, and I want to thank you for spending a couple hours speaking about Maya Deren.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay,
stimulating discussions.
Thank you.
Okay.
This was a delight.
Right.
Absolutely. Pleasure.